Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
On the fence. On the fence. That's our topic today. On the fence. What do you do with leaders who are on the fence? You might have some leaders who are thinking about making some policy changes. They're thinking about doing a training. But you have other leaders who are not so much in favor of that. Those are the people who I call on the fence. I can't believe we haven't talked about this in over a year of doing podcasts. It's not as black and white as you have on the one side resistant leaders, and on the other side you have leaders who are all for it. It's not that clear cut. I think probably the majority of churches are on the fence.
Well, I think you're right, Jimmy, and I do think we tend to look at things as black and white with a straight line down the middle, but they're not. And as you and I were talking prior to this podcast, there are numerous churches who are just kind of, like you said, sitting on the fence, not quite anti, not quite pro, in the fact that they're enthused to do something, just kind of in the middle where they're tabling things. Yeah. Just thinking for a while.
Well, what tends to happen to the churches that are on the fence is, it's a lot like what you see with politics. You have churches that just keep kicking that can down the road. Right. Yeah, we'll get back to you. Mm-hmm. We'll think about it. We'll talk about it at the next leadership meeting. So they kick that can down the road. And meanwhile, you go months and months and months, and months turn into years, and years turn into 5 years, and 5 years turns into a decade, where the church is still stuck in this rut, and they're not. I say church, I mean really it's any organization, but they get stuck in this rut where they're not making any movement toward actually creating safe spaces.
Well, don't you think that probably the biggest reason for not taking steps in, doing something is because they don't want to stir the pot.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Once that position changes where they say, yes, we need to do something and we need to do it now, that opens up a whole new arena, and they know it. So
it's interesting you said that. Last night I spoke out of state, and it was the minister who invited me, and he's a friend of mine, and I mean, he's not on the fence. I mean, he's fully on board. He wants a written policy in place. He wants really well training. He wants to call me back to do a full day training for the church. He definitely is not on the fence. He's on the one side of the fence, and he wants things done. And he said last night was not a training; it was just a talk, and I did a keynote talk there, and he said this is going to open up a lot of scabs.
Right.
He said we are peeling back the scabs for what I know is lying below the surface.
Okay.
And so we prayed before I started, and he said, I pray that as you begin to speak and peel these scabs off, and this church begins to bleed, that people realize the need that we need to stop the bleeding.
Okay, that's a really good visual. Yeah,
that's really powerful.
Yeah, it is.
And that's exactly what happened. I went in last night, and I was super proud of this church because they don't have any reason to have to face this that they know of.
Okay,
there's nothing going on right now as far as abuse scandals or anything like that. And so they called me in to do this talk. They're doing a series on protecting the home. And, it's each night they have a different speaker. So they didn't have any reason to have me there except that they're doing this series. And at the end of that, I went in just like, it's just my style. I just go in like guns a-blazing and,
Jimmy,
like
yes,
I don't hold anything back.
Yeah,
because when
right.
you're talking about abuse, you can't tiptoe around the subject. So
It's serious, very serious.
yeah. So I just went in and I drilled them on the bad theology that keeps churches in this never land where nothing ever gets done. And why they become so protective of abusers and so dismissive of victims. So when it was done, I had the elders come up and they shook my hand and they all thanked me and they said, we absolutely needed to hear that. And what you need to hear is that changes are going to be made.
That's awesome.
I said, you'll be hearing from us again.
That's wonderful. That's awesome. That's the outcome we want.
Yeah. So, here's an example where you had a leadership minus the minister who most likely was on the fence. And, they were kind of indifferent.
Right.
When he said he was going to have me come speak, there was not resistance, but it sounded like, they just didn't, to them it was somebody else coming in to fulfill this series.
It wasn't big on their radar because you said it when you started talking about this. They don't have any incidents that they're dealing with, so it's like, okay, that happens in other places, but we're good here now. So why start scratching the scabs and making us bleed if we don't have to?
Well, and as happens every time, there was a line of survivors who came up and spoke to me and thanked me and said, some of the things that I said, they had never heard any leader anytime express these things. And they said, for you to validate our pain and to paint the right picture of God and of Jesus, who are very protective of the innocents. They're like, we needed to hear that. We've never heard that before. And that, to me, that was really powerful. So what we want to do on this podcast is talk about, what do you do when you have leaders that are on the fence and either they're indifferent or they're kicking the can down the road or they're coming up with excuses for why they don't want to do it. They're not necessarily resistant, at least not all of them, but they're just kind of teetering back and forth. Well, I'll just come out and say it, push them off the fence.
I like that.
Yeah. And sometimes you have to force leaders to make decisions and to face hard truths. The reality is, when you sign up to be a leader of anything, of any organization, when you sign up to be a boss, when you sign up to own your own business, when you sign up as a minister, when you sign up as an elder, a deacon, when you're in any kind of a leadership position, whether you like it or not, you're agreeing to take on a high responsibility and to confront issues that are going to come up. You can't pretend like they don't exist.
Absolutely.
So my methodology is to force churches to face this in the eye. This issue. I bring it right to the forefront, using my own personal story, and then talking about cases that I have. And I just talked about yesterday, I talked about some of the emails that I received from people who are crying out for help. And I said, this is a typical average day for me. And they were horrific stories of abuse. And I said, this is an average, typical day for me.
And they're all over, meaning large churches, small churches, happy homes, sad homes.
Absolutely.
Thriving schools, inner city schools. They're all over.
Yeah.
Time and time again, the cries are the same.
Yeah.
We need help.
So, this was a case where sometimes it helps to have somebody come in who doesn't belong to that church or organization, who's been doing this for a long time, And this is not a plug for myself, by the way. There are so many advocates out there who are going around telling their stories. The point is, sometimes it takes somebody from the outside to come in and share their pain and their experience for us to wake up to the reality that this
makes it real, Jimmy.
Yeah.
When you hear it firsthand, then it becomes real.
Yeah. So, that's one of the ways that we can push people off of the fence, force them to confront this issue by causing them to have to face somebody who's lived through it.
I like that so much because, like you said, with that particular church you were with last evening, they had no real issues that they knew of. Life was pretty sweet.
Mm-hmm. Then I showed up.
Yeah, I know. I keep thinking about, no, absolutely. The point being to keep them in a safe place, to protect the ones that are there, and to minister to the ones who have been hurt years before.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah. And I gave them very tangible things, and I called the leaders and I said, you guys have to stand up very publicly. I said, you do not allow me to leave here and you guys remain silent. You need to stand before the church and let them see you standing shoulder to shoulder up front, and you look this congregation in the eye and you say, we will be safe people for you to come talk to. If you've been abused, if you are being abused, we will protect you. We will not tolerate abuse.
That's
ever.
Powerful.
I said, you guys can't just assume that they know your heart and that they're going to do that. You need to stand up here.
Well, silence
and say it.
Is the unspoken word often sends a message that's loud and clear. If you don't hear somebody say something like that, you have no idea if they're even aware that there is pain in that church from previous abuse.
Yeah.
So you having them or asking them to do that, the leaders, to stand up and verbalize, we are here, we will protect
and
you.
And visualize.
We are safe.
They need to stand up there and say.
Right. Absolutely.
And mean it.
Right. And mean it. So there's power in that, healing power in that.
So, that's one of the ways. Call in somebody to your church who's lived a painful experience, because it becomes really difficult to look somebody in the eyes, although it does happen, and too many survivors know this to be true. But it is collectively difficult for leaders to turn a blind eye when you have somebody who's bleeding out pain from their heart, who's standing before you in all that raw pain saying, I lived through this. For them to sit in that audience in front of the rest of their church, who's also in that audience, to hear that and to turn a blind eye, it's pretty difficult for them to walk away from that and not exercise compassion and vow to change things within their own organization. Now, where they do turn a blind eye to victims, to crying victims, is in these private meetings where the church doesn't see that. The church doesn't know that's going on. And so these little private meetings that they have with survivors, survivors are berated. They're not believed. They're told to forgive and move on. We need to bring this stuff out into the public eye. And there's nothing wrong with that. And, this approach was, it wasn't in your face. It wasn't done in a way where, anybody was twisting arms. It was just they did a series on protecting the home. And so it was really tasteful, and it just was really well done, and it resonated. And I just got a message today from that same minister, and he said, boy, people are talking about this a lot.
That's awesome to hear.
So
that's so encouraging to hear.
There are other times too, this is just another thought, but if people are not on the fence yet, if they're on the wrong side of the fence and they're just resistant, put them on the fence.
Right.
Force them onto the fence.
Now, how do you do that?
Then push them over.
I mean, how do you force a person, so to speak, to get on the fence?
Well, let me talk about one of the things that I recommend not doing. One of the things I recommend not doing is just getting fed up and leaving the church. Too many people do that, and the leaders win. The resistant leaders who fail to protect the innocent and who have blood on their hands, they win over and over and over again. My thing is, I recommend people who are able and willing to do it, they dig their heels in and say, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving. And we're going to keep talking about this until you address it in one way or the other. And
I think we need to speak to those who have been abused, though, and say it takes a great deal of strength to be that persistent person.
Yeah.
Not everybody who, wants to see change and who needs to see change is strong enough to be that persistent person.
No, but they can find people who are. Every organization has them. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Okay. Just I didn't want anybody to feel like, oh, wow, I
like
left.
They have to be the knight in shining armor.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
No, yeah.
Not everybody's able to be that person at this time.
That's right.
But there are enough advocates now, enough people who have enough strength and momentum that they can be that person for you.
Well, I mean, here's another thing too that gives people leverage within the church or whatever organization you're in. If you know of a past case where the church had an abuser in the organization and they kept it quiet, bring it to the forefront.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Bring it up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Force them to confront that and to give answers and say, why did you keep this quiet? Why are we still not talking about this? It happened here. Right. If you know that it happened there, force them to face it. Bring it out into the light. They've got to deal with it. You can't keep sweeping these issues. Not this issue. You cannot sweep it under the rug. It has to be dealt with. And if the leaders are creating that narrative and shrouding that in secrecy, the church has so much power in bringing that to light. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing unbiblical about that.
It needs to be done.
In fact, it's biblical to shine a light on that.
It creates a cleansing when you do that. Number one. Number two, I think you've seen it time and time again. There is a strengthening of the church unit and the people within when these issues are dealt with.
Yeah.
It's when everything's swept under the rug that there's that big, ugly pile up, and then things just crumble.
Yeah.
It deteriorates. Yeah.
I think the Catholic Church is seeing that. I just saw an article today that there's a pretty high up guy in the Catholic Church who he claims that donations are down. It's almost 50% at the Vatican, and that they're like 2 years away from being bankrupt.
No small wonder. I think people are very discouraged with the way things have been handled overall. I mean,
well, they see that things are still being swept under the rug.
Yeah,
and
terribly.
The Pope has, in my opinion, he's been a prime example of the poster child of what not to do, how not to respond when you have abuse. He still has not set his wheels down on his plane in Pennsylvania, the epicenter of where all this happened. The Pope couldn't bother himself to come to Pennsylvania and sit and cry with victims.
I can't imagine him doing it.
Over 1,000 of them that we know of. Over 1,000 of them right here in our backyard, and he couldn't bother himself. That was over a year ago that report came out. He has yet to land in Pennsylvania.
That's a good example of what happens when you avoid, when you refuse to face the truth.
Yeah. So, bringing things to the light and exposing that and saying, look, you need to deal with this, and you're going to deal with it one way or the other, whether it's through the pocketbook, or whether it's through church membership, or whether it's through lawsuits, one way or the other, you're going to have to face this and deal with it.
You and I were talking about prior to this podcast about if your church doesn't want to deal with anything or bring in somebody outside to help you place things, get things safe, that you can ask to use the facility,
Mm-hmm.
but you can set up a meeting. You can set up a speaker. You can set up whoever it is.
Yeah,
a
get donors in
panel.
your church,
Yeah.
and you pay for it. So it's
Right.
not the church's money. Yeah, if you have leaders who absolutely refuse to call in a speaker
Right.
and have somebody come talk or to do a training, fund it yourself.
Right.
There's nothing in the world that stops church members from raising their own
Right.
money. It's their money. It's your money. And you can withhold your donation to the church for a couple
Right.
weeks, and I'll put that into a fund and
Absolutely.
hire somebody and
Right.
have somebody come in.
Now,
Why not?
well, right. And if it gets to that point, that's just another avenue of sitting somebody on the fence.
Yeah.
Giving them that push.
Well, and the other thing, it rightfully makes the leaders look bad
Well.
because they refused. They
Right.
publicly refused.
yeah. Right.
And now the church said, well, we're going to do it anyway.
I just like that when the idea of the body coming together and saying, hey, we need this and we're going to go forward and do it.
Yeah.
We really are.
You don't need the leader's blessing
No,
to
no.
protect each other.
And if you can't have an open forum or whatever, a training, whatever it is that you want in the church building, schools, I know I worked on school board for 15 years. Often schools will allow you to use their auditoriums. You know, there are a number of different ways you can do
You can
this.
find a
but-
venue anywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You
Set up a
really
tent in
can.
a parking lot.
Yeah. Well, there have been so many local community forums for drugs and
Mm-hmm.
other such things that I think the time has come now for abuse. We can no longer sit
Yeah.
back and say, have a leader say, no, we're not going to do this.
If you want to make it really fun, if your leaders don't allow you to use the building, if you're the one funding it and the church won't fund it, if the leaders refuse to do it, say that they say, well, you know, you're not allowed to use our building. Do it on the adjacent property
You're terrible,
And-
Jimmy.
and advertise it in your local paper and say, the so-and-so church is having a training event on sexual abuse. The whole community is invited,
Oh, wow.
funded by the church members because the church leaders
Oh.
wouldn't allow us to do it.
Ouch, Jimmy. Ouch. Ouch. Yeah. I'm not sure what fence we would be sitting on. Yeah,
But you
we
know what?
laugh. Yeah, it works.
I'm
It
not really
does.
joking
No,
either, though.
I know that.
I mean,
right.
you cannot resist this issue. This isn't a minor issue.
No.
This isn't something that is it's on the wish list and just something that we want in the church.
Right.
This is people's lives are being taken from them. Their
When-
souls are being ravished.
When you spoke earlier in this podcast, you said, as always happens after a talk, you have a stream of survivors
Every
coming
time.
up to you. Well, what does that say? In every church, there are survivors. There's no exception. No exception. That's just the fact. That's all. The fact.
Yeah. It's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
And, again, if people are not on the fence, put them on the fence. If they're already on the fence, push them over and be creative. Talk to people in
Right.
your church. I still don't understand. I mean, I do. I don't want to sound offensive here. I do understand why people feel like the only option is to ask leaders for permission. There comes a point where, like, I'll give it an example of our personal parenting that we do in our home. Our kids ask us for everything. Like, can I go to the bathroom? Just go. Right?
Yeah.
Like we like to empower our kids.
How come you kids never asked
But-
us, Jimmy?
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
But-
just like, wow.
But church leaders, for some reason, have this uncanny ability to make people feel like they have to have permission to breathe,
There's a
to do
dominance.
anything.
There's a power thing. And I think we've all been trained under the demise of respect for those in leadership. And we feel like we cannot ever question or go against in any way that might, heaven forbid, be offensive to those in leadership. And I, for one, fall into that category. I have a real struggle with that. I have in the past. I am getting better at it, but questioning and speaking what I feel is the truth and what I feel I would like to see. But I think the majority of us feel this tug of war. This person's in authority. I'm not. It's my job to respect and obey, if you want to use that word. But that's why.
Yeah. I mean, I do. I understand it. But we also need to force people out of that mold. And I keep using that word force. I don't mean, like start throwing your weight around in the church and saying, you have no authority over me. I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying we need to go in and confront that abusive leadership structure that has nothing to do with leadership. It has everything to do with being authoritarian.
Right.
Leadership, every example of leadership that's given in the Bible is people leading by example, leading by righteousness, by the way that they live their lives. It's not saying, well, darn it, are you aware that I'm and then they start spewing out credentials and their position. In fact, so many times Paul says, I could appeal to you as an elder, but I don't.
Well, he called himself the chief of sinners, did he not? I mean,
and a servant. He said, I am first a servant.
Right.
In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul says, we apostles are first servants.
And
we're here to serve.
That's what good leaders are.
Yeah.
They are servants.
So, I just think we need to really confront that abusive kind of leadership and try to get yourself out of that mindset where your only option is to approach the leaders and get their permission. That's just not true. And, you can let them know, look, we need to address this topic, this issue of abuse of all kinds. I'm not just talking sexual abuse, of abuse of all kinds. We need to talk about it. We need to confront it. We need to speak to it. We need to condemn it. And we need to take actions to protect the innocent and the vulnerable within our flock.
Absolutely.
And if you're not behind that, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to stand up and we're not going to be rude. We're not going to be, I'm not saying to picket out in front of your churches and hold up signs and, I'm not talking about doing any of that. Just do what's right and don't say you're sorry for doing what's right.
I think that when there's a persistence in the truth, it won't go wrong. I think you were speaking last night, the way you were drawn in to speak in this series of protecting the family. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
It was a roundabout way of getting the message in, of clearing the air, of setting the stage, of getting the leadership on the fence.
And
that's
it was incredibly,
illustration.
what I witnessed last night was something that was incredibly unifying and it was healing for that church.
Right. So that was an example of doing things in the right way.
Yeah.
And that's an encouragement to everybody.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave you with this truth bomb. I'll say it again. If somebody's on the fence, if you have a group of leaders that are on the fence, give them a gentle nudge and push them off of the fence, but push them onto the right side.
Right.
Don't throw your weight around and be all bossy. Just help them to get on the right side of the fence. And if they're not on the fence yet, put them there. Find ways to put them on the fence where they're at least thinking about this subject, and then take it to the next step and try to the best of your ability to get them to confront this issue. Thank you all for tuning in. This week, just a reminder, is the Courage Conference down in Orlando. I'm going to be there along with my wife, though I think she's going to be doing her own thing. She's just coming to relax and get away. But I will be speaking on Sunday, and the event kicks off on Friday. It goes Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday is the exclusive leadership only that I am doing along with Lyria. So hopefully I'll see some of you down there.
And if anybody really cares, Granny's going to have Jimmy's kids.
She
So-
is. Yep.
I know. I'm
She is.
excited
We're
about it.
Gonna come
I
back.
am
Our kids are
super-
going to be corrupted.
No, I'm very excited about it.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next episode.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. Thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcast, or Stitcher. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron, and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.